A few years ago, I moved to a quiet little town tucked away in the hills. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, the streets felt frozen in time, and nothing ever seemed to happen. But there was one exception. The old abandoned hospital on the edge of town. Every time I passed it, I felt something like a strange pull in my chest, as if the building itself was watching me, calling me. The locals had plenty of stories, whispers of shadows moving in the windows, strange sounds after dark, even tales of people going inside and never coming out. I didn't believe any of it. Ghost stories are just stories, right? One night, curiosity got the better of me. I waited until the sun dipped below the hills, and the whole town slipped into silence. Armed with a flashlight, some snacks, and my phone, I walked toward the hospital under a sky so dark it felt like the stars had disappeared on purpose. As I got closer, the air grew colder. The path was cracked and overgrown, and every step sounded too loud. By the time I reached the hospital, the silence was suffocating. The building stood there, massive and broken, its shattered windows like black, empty eyes staring down at me. The front door hung open, gently creaking back and forth, almost like it was inviting me in. I stepped inside. The air was thick, a heavy sour mix of mildew, and something older, something that smelled like time itself, had rotted here. My flashlight cut through the dark, revealing hallways that stretched endlessly into the void, lined with peeling walls and broken furniture. Every footstep echoed, like the building was repeating my every move, mocking me. And even though I was alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I moved deeper, my flashlight flickering now and then. Rooms were filled with rusted gurneys and shattered equipment, like everyone just walked out one day and never came back. And then I found the staircase. The steps groaned under my weight, loud enough to make me wince, like the building itself didn't want me going any further. The second floor was even colder, and the air felt thick, almost hard to breathe. I passed door after door, most locked tight, but one stood slightly open, an old operating room. Inside, rusted tools lay scattered across a blood-stained table, and a torn, filthy sheet hung halfway off the gurney. That's when I heard it, a whisper, right behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming into my ribs, but there was no one there, just darkness. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, or the building settling. But I knew that was a lie. The deeper I went, the louder the whispers grew, soft at first, but then clearer, like they were whispering my name. Then my flashlight flickered, once, twice, and then it died, total darkness. My pulse exploded in my ears as I smacked the flashlight desperately until the beam flickered back on. And that's when I saw it, a figure, standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall, too tall, and its face, I can't even describe it because the shadows swallowed every detail. But I knew it was looking at me. It took a step forward, and so did I, except I was running. I stumbled down the stairs, every step screaming under my weight, my own breath ragged and uneven. The whispers chased me all the way to the front door, and when I finally burst outside, the night air hit me like a punch to the chest. I didn't stop running until the hospital was a distant shape against the sky. I never went back. To this day, the locals still tell their ghost stories. But now, when I hear them, I don't laugh, because I know the truth. Sometimes the stories are real, and sometimes the shadows watch you back. It was a brutal storm that night. Rain hammered against the windows, and the wind screamed like something was trying to tear its way inside. Thunder shook the walls, and lightning lit up the sky in violent flashes. I was working the night shift at the old hotel, stuck behind the front desk, fighting off sleep. Nights like this were always the worst. Too quiet, too long, and way too easy to imagine things lurking just outside the door. I was halfway through my third cup of coffee when the front door creaked open. A man stumbled in, drenched from head to toe. His clothes clung to his skin, his hair plastered to his face. But none of that is what made my stomach drop. It was the blood. Smears of dark red covered his shirt, streaked down his arms, even staining his hands. He wasn't just wet from the rain. He was soaked in something much worse. His eyes darted around the lobby, wild and desperate, like he was running from something. He staggered up to the desk. "I need a room," he muttered, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken in hours. I tried to play it cool, but my hands shook as I slid him a registration form. His trembling fingers gripped the pen, scrawling a name across the page. John Doe. Fake, obviously. But I wasn't about to argue with a blood-soaked stranger at 2 a.m. The only room left was number 13. I handed him the key, careful not to touch his stained hands. He snatched it and disappeared down the hallway, his footsteps uneven, the air thick with tension. I should have let it go, should have just minded my business. But something felt wrong. I picked up the phone and called the police. I told them about the man, the blood, the fake name, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder like someone was after him. They promised to send someone right away. The minutes crawled by like hours. The storm outside grew louder, rattling the windows, making the old building groan like it was alive. Every creak made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. And somewhere down that hallway, room 13 sat in silence, hiding its secrets. When the police finally arrived, I felt like I could breathe again, at least for a second. 2 officers, rain dripping off their hats, stepped into the lobby. I pointed them to room 13, and they moved down the hall without a word. I couldn't help myself. I followed at a safe distance, heart pounding louder than the thunder. They knocked on the door. No answer, just silence. Then slowly, the door creaked open. The man stood there, looking worse than before. His skin was pale, eyes sunken, blood drying on his shirt like rust. The officer spoke to him quietly, and after a minute he stepped aside. They went in, and when they came out, the man was in handcuffs. He glanced at me as they led him through the lobby, and for a moment I saw something in his face. Not anger, not guilt, just fear. One officer stayed behind to take my statement. The other took the man out into the storm. As I described the night, the officer's expression hardened. When I finished, he closed his notebook and said something I'll never forget. My stomach turned. I had a feeling something was wrong, but hearing it out loud made it real. The officer thanked me and left, leaving me alone with the storm and the silence. I sat back down at the front desk, my mind racing. Who had he killed? Why had he come here? What was he running from? I didn't know, and I probably never would. Morning finally came, the storm easing into a gray, empty sky. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, I stepped outside and breathed in the damp air. But the relief didn't last, because every time a storm rolls in now, I remember that night. The blood, the fear, the look in his eyes. And every time someone asks for room 13, I hesitate, just for a second. Because sometimes the scariest part of the job isn't the ghost stories. It's the real ones. It was one of those perfect summer nights. Warm air, clear sky, and the crackle of a campfire by the river. My friends and I were huddled around the flames, roasting marshmallows, trading ghost stories, and soaking in the night. The firelight flickered, throwing jagged shadows across our faces, and the soft murmur of the river felt strangely soothing. That was before Mark spoke up. Mark was the oldest in our group, the one who always had the scariest stories. But that night, his voice dropped lower than usual, almost like he didn't want anyone or anything to overhear. The group went quiet. Even the river seemed to hush. We all shifted uncomfortably. The fire crackled louder. The night felt colder. No one spoke. One by one, my friends drifted off to their tents, but I stayed by the fire a little longer. I couldn't shake the story, the image of Maria crying by the river. That's when I heard it, a soft, broken sob carried by the breeze. I froze, staring into the dark, but everyone else was asleep. The sob grew louder. My skin prickled as a cold breeze curled around me. My heart pounded so hard, I swear the earth could feel it. I stood up, legs shaking, and walked toward the river. The crying was unmistakable now. Raw, aching, ancient grief blending with the rushing water. And then through the trees, I saw her. A woman stood at the water's edge, dressed in white, her long dark hair tangled in the wind. Her shoulders shook with every sob. I wanted to run. I should have run, but I couldn't move. She turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes black and empty. A bottomless pit of sorrow and rage. Her hand reached out, fingers long and thin, bones pressing against her ghostly skin. "Mis hijos," she whispered. "My children." My throat locked. No sound came out. The air grew icy and I felt it. A pull, like invisible hands gripping my arms, dragging me toward her. My feet slid forward against my will. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. In pure panic, I stumbled backward, breaking free. I turned and ran, branches tearing at my skin, breath burning in my lungs. Her cries followed me, growing softer and softer until they melted into the night. I burst into camp, gasping for air. My friends blinked at me from their tents, confused. Mark's face darkened. He asked. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. We just sat by the fire, staring into the dark, listening for footsteps or sobs. When dawn finally came, sunlight chased away the fear, but only for a while. Even now, years later, whenever I hear the sound of a river at night, I remember her.